Welcome to Mr. Chalk's Revision Tips.
When answering exam questions, there are a few key things to remember, right? So just remember, exam technique is a key part in preparation for any exams, and it's something that you'll pick up the more you go and you do past papers. Right, so many questions in exams are repeats of what will be in old exams. So going and looking at lots of generic questions beforehand is a good idea. When going and answering and questions and reading them, there's a few things just take into account. Make sure you go read the question at least twice so you don't make any mistakes when you're reading them. As you're reading them, go highlight key information. Don't make assumptions about what the question is asking. Make sure after you've answered it, you go check your work for daft errors that you might make. And if it involves going and answering something where there's some calculation, make sure that you write your workings out down. Right, let's go and have a look at the question.
First thing when thinking about the mammalian gaseous exchange system is that we need to consider its actual structure before we go and start talking about the alveoli. The thing where people quite often trip up is that they only go and talk about the alveoli. So if we start off, remember it starts off with the nasal cavity. Right, remember the nasal cavity lies just above the mouth, etc. A few key things about the nasal cavity that are worth noting. So the fact that it's got a large surface area and a relatively good blood supply that keeps the air warm as it's moving down into the lungs. It's got various mucus secreting cells that will go and trap dust and microbes, and the moist surfaces increase the humidity, so reduce evaporation from the lungs. Next part that we need to consider is the trachea, or the windpipe, but please call it the trachea, that leads down into the lungs. Right, so this is leading from the nasal cavity. So some key things to think about. The fact that it's got cartilage rings. Right, these cartilage rings, they're kind of C-shapes like that, and they hold the trachea open. But they can also go and stretch a little bit, so if you need to cough something up, you're able to do that. It's got ciliated epithelial cells and goblet cells, right? So the goblet cells are secreting mucus, which trap dust and microbes, and the ciliated cells go and move that mucus up towards where it'll pass down your epiglottis, then down your esophagus towards the stomach. Next bit that we need to think about are the bronchi. So the bronchi are two large kind of like tubes that lead away from the trachea. So key things is that they're covered in smooth muscle. So remember when we're talking about it, be specific on the type of muscle that it's got. Right, so this allows the movement of air in and out and helps maintain that concentration gradient of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So that takes us on to thinking about the actual alveoli themselves. Right, so there are a number of adaptations that we can talk about. So the fact that there's a lot of them gives them a very, very large combined surface area where gas exchange can take place. They are relatively moist inside. Remember, if they're moist, then the oxygen can dissolve into the moisture before diffusing across the cells into the blood. Talking about the blood, they're covered in a good network of capillaries. The alveoli are only actually one cell thick, so that gives a very, very short diffusion distance. It's worth noting that the alveoli are at the end of the bronchioles. Right, we've already talked about the fact that there's a nice short diffusion distance for diffusion to take place. So because there's good ventilation provided by the lungs contracting and relaxing, or the rib cages and diaphragm contracting and relaxing, that helps maintain that good high concentration of oxygen inside of the alveoli. So the oxygen inside of the alveoli will always be higher than that in the blood. The good blood supply goes and brings deoxygenated blood to the alveoli so we can get rid of carbon dioxide. And the oxygenated blood is carried away. So that diffusion gradient is maintained. That's a relatively important phrase to use. If we just go and look at a very, very quick question about it. Right, this is kind of a general question that can come up. So it's talking about outlining the structures involved in the mammalian gaseous exchange system. Right, for each structure, explain how this increases the efficiency of gaseous exchange. Right, so the fact that it's talking about for each kind of gives you the clue that there's more than one bit that it wants you to talk about. So, start off, we talk about the nasal cavity. Like we said, it's got a good blood supply, it keeps the air warm, it secretes mucus to trap dust and microbes, and it's got a moist surface, so it stops the evaporation of water. Then move on to talking about the trachea. Talk about the trachea having those cartilage rings to help keep it open. Talk about them having goblet cells in order to secrete mucus that traps dust and microbes, and ciliated cells which then go and move that towards the stomach. Talk about the bronchi and the bronchioles in terms of having smooth muscle which allows air to move in and out, so it means that concentration gradient. Then move on to talking about the alveoli. So you're almost going in order from the top of the gaseous exchange system down towards the bottom. So you can talk about the alveoli having a thin epithelial wall to go and reduce diffusion distance. You can talk about it having elastic fibres, right, which help increase elastic recoil to help squeeze the air out. You could talk about the fact that there's a large number of them, so that increases the surface area. The fact that there's a good blood supply helps maintain that high concentration gradient, and that all goes and allows us oxygen to diffuse in and carbon dioxide to diffuse out. The only other thing that's worth talking about is the fact that you've got the diaphragm. Remember, if we're moving down, the diaphragm sits underneath the lungs. So the diaphragm, when it contracts, that increases lung volume and causes a reduction in the pressure so air goes and moves in. So they're just a few key things that you can talk about when answering questions on mammalian gaseous exchange.
So hopefully you have found that useful. If you've got any questions, then drop it in the comments below, and we'll be uploading a lot more. Right, good luck, folks.